envelope had been sitting in the same drawer for 13 years. Cal Driscoll knew exactly where it was. Bottom drawer of the dry sink in the kitchen, underneath the deed to the property, and a broken compass that he kept meaning to throw away, and never did. He hadn't opened the envelope in all that time. He'd moved it 3 times, once when he left Cheyenne, once when he bought this land, once when the flood got into the floorboards and he had to pull everything out and start over. Each time he held it for a moment, felt the weight of it, and put it back without looking inside. It was a letter from his brother Emmett. He knew that much because he recognized the handwriting on the outside. He hadn't needed to open it to know who sent it. He just hadn't been ready to know what it said, and somewhere along the way, not being ready had curdled into something else. Something he didn't have a clean word for. Something that lived between guilt and stubbornness and sat there quietly year after year. The way bad weather sits on the mountains before it decides to come down. He was 53 years old, and he still wasn't ready. But that morning, a Tuesday in late September of 1889, sky the color of old pewter wind already coming off the high country. With an edge to it, he pulled the drawer open and looked at the envelope lying there. And he thought for the first time in a long time that maybe ready wasn't the point. Maybe the point was something simpler and harder than that. He didn't take it out. He closed the drawer and went to hitch the wagon. He had a woman to pick up from the train station. The agency out of St. Louis had sent 3 letters before Cal responded to any of them. The first he'd read and set down without finishing. The second he'd used to start a fire. The third arrived on a cold morning in February when the well had frozen, and 2 of his fence posts had blown over in the night, and his left knee had swollen up so bad he could barely put weight on it. And he'd sat at the kitchen table and thought, with the kind of flat clarity that comes when a man runs out of pride, that he needed help, not a wife. He was honest with himself about that much, at least. He needed someone who could handle the books, manage the small commerce of running a working spread, and cook something other than the 4 things he knew how to cook. If that arrangement came with legal paperwork and a shared name, he wasn't opposed. He just didn't have any illusions about what it was. He wrote back to the agency and said so. Plainly. No poetry, no false promises. He'd described the land and the house and the work. He'd mentioned his knee. He said he was not a difficult man, but he was not an easy one either. And whoever came should know the difference before she got on the train. They'd written back saying they had someone suitable. Her name was Wren Calloway. He'd read that name twice when he first saw it. Not sure why it caught him. It was an unusual name, small and particular, like the bird, like something that had decided to be exactly what it was and nothing more. He'd put the letter down and looked out the window at the flat November range and thought, well. Then he'd written back and said, all right. That had been 6 months ago. Now he stood on the platform at Laramie Station with a folded paper in his coat pocket, watching the train breathe steam into the cold morning air. And he had the uncomfortable awareness that he had no idea what this woman actually looked like, what she actually wanted or what she was going to make of him when she saw him. He wasn't a vain man, but he was old enough to know that showing up to your own life was sometimes harder than it looked. People came off the train in clusters, families traveling men a minister with a black bag, who looked like he'd seen too much of what he was supposed to fix. Cal watched each face. Most of them moved with the purposeful blankness of people who knew exactly where they were going. He waited. She came off near the end. One canvas bag in her hand small enough that it didn't strain her. A wooden box roughly the size of a bread crate set down on the platform step beside her feet, bound with rope sealed with a small brass lock he could see even from 10 feet away. She didn't look flustered or uncertain. She looked the way a person looks when they're scanning a room they've already decided is manageable. Her eyes found him before he reached her. He wasn't hard to pick out. He supposed he was the only man on the platform standing still. He said his name. She said hers. They shook hands. Her grip was firm and brief. The grip of someone who'd learned early that a limp handshake was a kind of apology. He picked up the wooden box. It was heavier than it looked. Heavier than what he'd have packed for a long trip. And he didn't ask about it. She didn't explain it. They walked to the wagon in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable so much as preliminary, two people taking each other's measure without making a production of it. On the road out of Laramie, the land opened up the way it always did when you left town, wide and rolling and pale gold in the early light. The kind of country that some people found beautiful, and some people found terrifying, and some people he'd noticed found both at the same time. He talked about the land because it was what he knew. Who owned what? Where the water ran? Which of the ranges were worth grazing and which were marginal? He wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to give her something useful. She listened. She asked a few questions, practical ones about the nearest town, about the roads in winter. And then almost casually, she asked about Harlan Fitch. Cal told her what he could. Fitch owned the best grazing land in the county, and a good portion of the timber rights to the east. He had interests in the freight business, which meant he had interests in who got their goods moved and who waited. He was on civil terms with the territorial government in Cheyenne, which meant things tended to go his way. He was not a man you wanted to argue with over a fence line. He said all of this in the same tone he'd used to describe the water table. But he noticed something. He noticed her hand, the one resting on the edge of the wagon bench, close slowly around the wood as he spoke Fitch's name. Not flinch. Something more deliberate than a flinch. Like a person filing information away in a place they'd already prepared for it. He let it go. He'd asked for someone capable of handling business, and capable people didn't always announce what they were thinking. He had no room to complain about that particular quality. The farm was smaller than she'd expected. He could see that in her face when they pulled up. Not disappointment exactly, more like recalibration. She walked through the rooms without comment, the way a person does when they're being fair to something they haven't decided about yet. The kitchen was clean. The stove worked. There was a bedroom at the back with a good window, and he'd made up the bed with sheets that had been washed in the last month, which cost him something in pride to admit had required a specific effort. He showed her the room. He said she'd have it to herself. She looked at him. He said it again with the same plainness he'd used in the letter. He wasn't pretending the arrangement was something other than what it was. But he also wasn't going to be a man who pushed. That part of things could wait until there was something between them, other than a letter from an agency and a wagon ride. She put the wooden box on the shelf above the dresser. She locked it with the small brass key she kept on a cord around her neck. And she did this without any self-consciousness, as if locking things away was simply a habit she'd long stopped explaining. He left her to settle in and went back to work. Keswick Flats sat 11 miles from the farm, which was close enough to matter and far enough that you had to mean it when you went. It had one main street, one jail, one church at the end of the road that had been built with optimism and was now serving a congregation that had over the years learned more about endurance than hope. There was a livery, a saloon that also served meals, and Bess Morrow's general store, which was the closest thing the town had to a civic institution. Bess had been running the store since her husband died in 1871, and she had developed over those years an absolute economy of speech that some people mistook for coldness, and other people recognized as the particular fluency of someone who had learned that most words were decorative. She said what she meant. She meant what she said. She had no patience for the space between those two things. Cal brought Wren to town 3 days after she arrived. He introduced her to the people he knew, which wasn't many because Cal had lived in Keswick Flats for 12 years, without ever quite deciding to be part of it. He was known as reliable and private and someone whose counsel you might seek on a practical matter which was different from being liked, but in cattle country was often worth more. Bess looked at Wren the way she looked at everything directly without pretense, and shook her hand and said, "Welcome," which from Bess was not nothing. Cal moved to look at a piece of tack he needed to replace, and in the moment his back was turned. Bess said something to Wren in a low voice. He didn't hear it. He didn't think it was meant for him. Wren's expression didn't change, but she held Bess's gaze for a moment longer than a polite response required. He filed that away, too. Harlan Fitch came into the store while they were still there. This was not, Cal had long since concluded, a man who did things by accident. Fitch moved through the world with the unhurried certainty of someone who had arranged most of it to his liking, and was simply making the rounds to confirm that everything was still in order. He was 55, perhaps, 56. Dressed simply but expensively in the understated way of men who no longer needed to announce themselves. His handshake was the first thing you noticed, warm and steady, the handshake of a man who had practiced it until it contained exactly the right amount of pressure. He greeted Cal with the easy familiarity of two men who had arrived at a kind of mutual non-interference over the years. Not friends, not enemies, just two people who had decided for their own separate reasons to leave each other alone. Cal had always been the more deliberate one in maintaining that arrangement. Then Fitch looked at Wren. He said her name, her married name, Driscoll. And then, almost as an afterthought, her family name with a small tilt of his head. He said he believed he'd known someone by the name of Calloway some time back. Said it lightly, the way you say something you're leaving out in the open for whoever wants to pick it up. Wren said that was a common enough name. Fitch agreed that it was. He smiled not warmly but accurately. The smile of a man who says the right thing, because he's thought about what the right thing is. He made a small pleasantry about the season, said he hoped she found the country agreeable, and moved on. Cal watched him go. Then he looked at Wren. She was standing with both hands loose at her sides, her face arranged in the mild expression of a woman who has just had a perfectly ordinary conversation. But the color in her cheeks was slightly different than it had been before Fitch walked in, and her breathing was just a fraction shallower than it needed to be. And Cal had spent enough years reading horses and weather and men who were trying not to be read to know the difference between calm and the performance of calm. He didn't say anything until they were back in the wagon and a mile out of town. He said without looking at her, "You know him." She said she'd never met him before in her life. He nodded, because that was technically a different thing than what he'd said, and they both knew it. He let the horses find their pace, and he thought about that distinction the rest of the way home. The wedding was held on a Friday morning in the parlor of Judge Elias Croft, who performed civil ceremonies on a sliding scale and asked no questions beyond the ones the law required. Bess Morrow stood as witness. She wore her work apron because she had to be back at the store by noon, and she'd said so plainly when asked. It took 11 minutes. Cal and Wren signed the papers. The judge shook their hands. Bess signed her name in the margin where indicated in handwriting that was brisk and legible like everything else about her. Outside, while Cal spoke briefly with the judge about a property matter, Bess put her hand briefly on Wren's arm and said something close enough to her ear that it wasn't meant to carry. Wren went still. She didn't look at Bess. She looked at the street, at the dust moving slow in the autumn air at the false front of the hardware store across the road, and her face did something complicated that she brought back under control in less time than it took to notice. Then Cal came out, and they walked to the wagon. He had heard 4 words of what Bess had said. He hadn't heard enough to be sure of the rest. But he heard the name Fitch, and he heard the word trust. And he thought about that on the drive to the supper they took at the saloon. And he thought about it that evening while Wren sat at the kitchen table going through the household accounts he'd left for her. And he thought about it late that night when he sat alone in the kitchen and the farmhouse was quiet. The wooden box sat on her shelf behind a closed door. The envelope sat in the drawer of the dry sink. He poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey he didn't particularly want and sat with it and did not drink it. West of town, 2 miles past the last proper fence line, there was a place where a small creek ran down from the high country and bent around a stand of cottonwoods before disappearing into the flatter ground. Cal had stopped there a handful of times over the years, not for any purpose, just because the sound of the water and the shade of the trees made the particular quality of silence there different from the silence everywhere else. Less empty, more like a pause. On the afternoon after the wedding, he stopped there on the way back from an errand he'd invented, and Wren was with him because he hadn't found a graceful way to leave her at home. He pulled the horses up without explaining why. He climbed down and filled his hat from the creek and watered the near horse, and when he turned around, she was sitting on the bank with her boots off and her feet in the water looking downstream. He sat down a few feet from her. The cottonwoods were losing their leaves, not dramatically, just letting them go one at a time, in the light wind yellow against the pale blue sky. He asked her because it was the least dangerous question he could think of, whether she'd grown up near water. She said, Ohio. She said Lake Erie, that she'd grown up close enough to it that she could smell it on certain mornings when the wind came from the north. He said that was a lot of water. She said it was. She said big water made her feel steady because it didn't seem to be in a hurry. Small water like this always seemed like it was going somewhere and not sure it was gonna make it. He looked at the creek for a moment. He said every creek he'd ever known got somewhere eventually. She said, did he know where this one ended up? He said he didn't. Said he'd never followed it far enough to find out. She looked at him then, not the way she'd looked at him before. not with the careful, evaluating attention she'd been giving him since she got off the train. Just looked at him like she was seeing something she hadn't expected and hadn't decided what to make of yet. He looked back at the water. They sat there for a while without talking, which was the first time since she'd arrived that silence between them had felt like something other than two strangers being polite. He was in the kitchen when she came to find him that evening. She didn't start with an explanation. She went to her room, came back with the wooden box, set it on the table between them, and unlocked it with the key from around her neck. Inside were papers, letters, a land survey with handwritten annotations, a ledger page torn carefully along the binding, the numbers on it written in a hand he didn't recognize, and on top of all of it, a single letter, the paper gone soft, with handling that she unfolded and placed in front of him. He read it. It was from her father, Fletcher Calloway. Written 8 months ago from a town 3 days' ride northeast of Keswick Flats. The letter was short. A man writing in a hurry or a man writing carefully, because he knew he had to be brief. He said he'd found something. He said he wasn't sure he was safe. He said if he hadn't sent another letter within 30 days, she should not come looking for him alone. He hadn't sent another letter. Cal read it twice, set it down. He didn't move it back toward her. He left it between them where it was. He said, "When did you stop expecting another letter?" She said, "About 6 months ago." He said, "And that's when you wrote to the agency." She said, "That's when I wrote to the agency." He looked at the letter again, then at her. She was watching him with the stillness of a person who has been holding something for a long time and has finally set it down somewhere and is waiting to see if the surface holds. He said, "What did he find?" She opened the wooden box again and took out the torn ledger page. She spread it flat on the table. Columns of numbers, names, amounts, the kind of record that meant nothing unless you knew what it was a record of. Some entries had small notations beside them. A symbol repeated several times that looked like an abbreviation for something she hadn't been able to work out. Her father had been a bookkeeper. She said this simply as a fact. He'd worked for small ranching operations his whole life, moving from county to county, keeping the kind of accounts that small outfits couldn't afford to hire lawyers to manage. He was good with numbers. He was good at seeing what numbers were hiding. She said he wrote to me 2 months before that last letter. Said he'd taken a job keeping accounts for several operations in the Keswick Flats area. Said the money was good. Said the country was hard, but interesting. She said he also said one of the men he was working for kept 2 sets of books. Said it so casually in the middle of a letter about the weather and a horse he'd bought that she'd almost missed it. Like a man mentioning that he'd found a rattlesnake in the barn, matter of fact, because panicking didn't help but wanting someone to know. Cal looked at the ledger page. He thought about Fitch and the freight business and the land and the easy way the man moved through the world, the way things tended to go his way, and the way he'd said the name Calloway in Bess's store, lightly, deliberately leaving it out there, like a stone in the middle of a road. He thought about Emmett. He didn't say what he thought about. He asked her instead what she needed from him, not what she wanted, what she needed. He asked it because he thought she was a person who would know the difference. She said, "I need to stay. I need a reason that doesn't raise questions. I need someone who knows this country. and is not already owned by it. He looked at her across the table with the lamp between them, throwing its modest yellow light. He said you came a long way on a thin plan. She said, I came a long way because there wasn't a better one. He thought about that. He said, all right. He said it the same way he'd said it 6 months ago when he'd written back to the agency. Flat plain meaning exactly what it sounded like, and nothing more dramatic than that. He got up to bank the stove for the night. She locked the box and went to her room. He sat back down at the kitchen table alone, and he thought about a man who kept 2 sets of books. And he thought about the word Bess had said that he'd only half heard. And he thought about a father who'd walked into something and not walked back out. And he thought about the way Fitch's face had been when he'd said that name light easy. The face of a man who had arranged things. He opened the dry sink drawer. He looked at the envelope. He did not take it out. He closed the drawer and went to bed and lay awake longer than was useful looking at the ceiling of the room he'd slept in, alone for 12 years listening to the wind come off the high country and move through the grass around the house, thinking about a woman on the other side of a wall who had crossed half the country on the thinnest of plans, because there hadn't been a better one, and who was now by legal fact, if not by anything warmer, his wife. 10 days after Wren arrived, a man came to the farm. It was mid-morning. Cal was at the fence on the eastern edge of the property replacing a post that had rotted through at the base. He heard the horse before he saw it, one rider coming at an unhurried walk, which was not the pace of someone with a message worth knowing. The man reined in at a distance that was polite only in the technical sense. He was Cal's age, maybe older, wearing the kind of plain work clothes that told you nothing. He had a face that had been lived in hard. He sat on his horse and looked at Wren, who had come out from the house when she heard the hooves. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in the conversational tone of a man asking about the price of lumber, "Fitch wants to know if you've found what you're looking for." He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come, and the sound of the hooves faded into the wide quiet of the range. Cal lowered the fence post he was holding. He looked at Wren. She was standing in the yard with her arms at her sides, and her face was very still, in the particular way that stillness becomes its own kind of noise. He said, "Have you?" She looked at him. Just looked at him. He picked up the post again and thought for a moment and then set it down again. He said quietly, because the wind had dropped and there was no reason to be loud, "We're not going to solve this by waiting." She said no. He said, "Then we start looking." She said, "I've been looking since I got here." He said, "I know. Now I'm looking too." He said it the way he said most things, without ornament, without promise beyond the thing itself. But she was watching his face when he said it, and whatever she saw there made her look down at the ground for a moment, in the particular way of a person who has been carrying something alone and has just had someone put a hand under one end of it. He went back to the fence post. She went back inside, and the land lay quiet around them in the September sun. And somewhere to the west, past the last ridge, past the range, Fitch's cattle had grazed into nothing. There was a place Cal had always known about and never had a reason to go to. He thought he might have a reason now. He left the fence post where it was and went to saddle his horse. He started with the people who had lost something, Not the ones who talk about it openly. Those were useless because anyone willing to complain at full volume had already been managed, their complaints absorbed into the general noise of the county and neutralized. He was looking for the ones who'd gone quiet. The ranchers whose spreads had shrunk over the past 5 years in ways that didn't make sense given what he knew about the land and the water and the price of beef. The men who changed the subject when certain things came up. The ones who looked at their boots when Fitch's name was mentioned in a room. He found 3 of them in a week without asking directly for anything. He just showed up at the right times at the smithy when Amos Pierce was waiting on a wheel repair, and had nothing to do but talk at the grain exchange when Luther Vane was standing in line with his hat in his hands, and the particular patience of a man who'd learned that complaining cost more than it was worth. He bought coffee. He listened. He said very little. What he pieced together slowly, the way you piece together a picture from what's wrong with the edges rather than what's right with the center, was this. Harlan Fitch had been buying land or appearing to buy it through a series of agreements that looked like standard grazing leases and water rights arrangements, but contained buried in the language that most men in the county couldn't parse. Without a lawyer, they couldn't afford provisions that transferred the meaningful use of the land without technically transferring the deed. A man might still own his 300 acres on paper, but Fitch owned the water access, or the right-of-way to the road, or the mineral rights beneath the soil, owned the one thing the man needed to make his land worth anything, which meant the man didn't actually own much at all. He just owned the paperwork. It was elegant in the cold mechanical way that a trap is elegant, and somewhere in the machinery of it, there was a bookkeeper who'd looked at 2 sets of numbers and understood what the distance between them meant. On the 11th day, Cal took Wren into town for supplies and left her at Bess's store while he went to price some lumber he didn't particularly need. He was gone 40 minutes. When he came back, Wren was helping Bess stack shelving, and they were talking in the low, purposeful way of 2 people who have found they speak the same language. He didn't interrupt. He bought what he came for and carried it to the wagon and waited. On the ride home, Wren told him what Bess had said the day of the wedding. She told it plainly, the way she did most things. Bess had said, "Don't trust anything Fitch says about your husband, including the good things." She hadn't explained it. She'd said it like a person leaving a lantern at the edge of a dark stretch of road. Here's some light, whether you use it is your business. Cal kept his eyes on the horses. He said, "What's she talking about?" Wren said, "I was hoping you'd tell me." He thought about that for the length of a mile. The grass was brown now along the road, pressed flat by the previous night's wind, and the sky had that particular high country clarity that came in October, when the air thinned out and everything looked closer than it was. He said without drama, because it wasn't dramatic so much as old Fitch and I go back further than Keswick Flats. He didn't say more than that. Not because he was being cagey. He'd never been a man who withheld things for tactical reasons, but because the shape of what came next wasn't clear yet, and he had a lifelong habit of not speaking until the shape was clear. She didn't push. He noticed that. It was the kind of restraint that cost something, and the fact that she paid it told him something about her he hadn't fully understood before. That evening, she went to see Fitch alone. He didn't know this until after. She'd told him she was going to the milliner's about some fabric she needed. The milliner was on the same street as Fitch's office. He'd had no reason to question it, and hadn't. She sat in Fitch's office for 20 minutes. She told Cal about it that night, at the table, not to confess, but to report clearly without apology, with the detachment of someone describing a reconnaissance rather than a mistake. She said Fitch's office was a careful room. Everything in it was placed to produce a specific impression. The quality of the furniture, the frame maps on the wall showing his land holdings, the particular tidiness of the desk. She said the desk had 2 books on it, one open, one closed. The open one she'd been able to read at an angle while they talked. She'd recognized the format because her father had kept accounts in the same general structure. She'd spent 12 minutes looking at Fitch's face and listening to his voice, and letting her eyes drift to the open ledger with the practiced casualness of a woman who'd grown up watching her father's hands move across columns of numbers and had absorbed without trying to the grammar of that language. What she saw didn't fully make sense yet, but she'd committed enough of it to memory that she could reconstruct the key columns. Then she'd made him an offer. Cal sat very still. She said it in the same reporting voice she had told Fitch she knew her father was still alive, and she would take herself and what she knew and leave Keswick Flats entirely, and no one would hear another word from her in exchange for Fletcher Calloway being returned. Cal looked at her across the table. He said, "You went alone." She said, "Yes." He said, "And he now knows you're operating independently." She said, "I thought..." He said, "He now knows you're operating independently, and he knows I'm connected to it, and he knows you're willing to negotiate, which tells him you're willing to deal, which tells him what you value most." The silence after that had a different quality than the silences they'd shared before. This one had weight on both sides. He wasn't angry the way some men got angry loud, large, taking up space with it. It was quieter than that, and therefore harder to sit with. She said, "I understand what I did." He said, "Do you?" She said, "I made him feel safe enough to show me something. He was too confident to close the ledger when I came in." He looked at her. She said it wasn't only a mistake. He said it was mostly a mistake. She said yes, mostly. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark range and the sky over it. There were stars, too many of them, the kind of sky that made you feel the distance between where you were and anywhere else. He said, "We're out of time to do this carefully." She said, "I know." He said 2 people came by and stood outside the fence for 20 minutes after supper. They rode off when I came out, but they weren't here by accident. She had gone still. He turned from the window. He said, "Get me everything in that box." The next morning, he went to see Harlan Fitch himself. He went alone. He didn't tell Wren where he was going. He told himself this was to protect her from a conversation that had nothing to do with her. And that was partly true. And the rest of the truth was that he wanted to handle it the way he'd handled things for most of his life. Directly man to man, by offering something and expecting something in return. He walked into Fitch's office without having himself announced. Fitch looked up from his desk with the mild interest of a man who finds an uninvited guest moderately useful rather than inconvenient, which told Cal he'd been expected. Cal sat down across from him and said what he'd come to say. He said they both knew things about the winter of 1876 that had never been put into any official record. He said that arrangement had suited them both for 13 years, and he was willing to extend it indefinitely. He said the price for that extension was the return of Fletcher Calloway unharmed, and the end of any interest Fitch had in the affairs of Cal's household. Fitch listened to all of this with his hands folded on the desk and his expression attentive and unsurprised. Then he opened the bottom left drawer of his desk. He took out a folder and set it on the desk between them and opened it. Inside was a document. Cal looked at it. He felt the particular sensation of a man who has walked into a room and found that the furniture has been arranged specifically for him, that the room was ready before he arrived. Which means the room was never really his. The document was a deposition, dated 1877, witnessed and notarized. It described events that Cal recognized in the specific way you recognize something you've spent years not thinking about. It described his presence, his silence, what the silence had cost. His name was on it. His age at the time, 40. His occupation, Deputy Sheriff, Laramie County. Fitch looked at him across the desk with the expression of a man who is sorry things have come to this and is very thoroughly lying about being sorry. He said, "Cal, you know I've held on to this a long time. You know I've never used it. I think that demonstrates a good deal of goodwill." Cal looked at the document. He said, "You used it right now." Fitch tilted his head slightly, conceding the point with the generosity of a man who can afford to concede points. He said, "I think what would serve everyone best is for you and your wife to find Keswick Flats to be a pleasant place to live quietly. I think that's a reasonable outcome." "I'm not an unreasonable man." Cal stood up. He didn't take the document. He didn't have anything to say that would improve the situation. The situation was what it was. He'd brought the only thing he had to trade, and the other man had already owned it. Had owned it before Cal sat down. Had owned it probably since the moment Cal first appeared in Keswick Flats 12 years ago, and had simply been waiting for the moment when it would be useful to let him know. He walked out of the office and into the street and stood in the October sun and felt the particular coldness of a man who has tried the thing he knows how to do and found that it doesn't work here. He rode home. He didn't tell her what had happened at Fitch's office, not that night. He sat on the porch while the light failed and the temperature dropped and the stars came out again relentless and indifferent. And Wren came out sometime around 8 o'clock and sat in the other chair and didn't ask him anything. That was the thing he kept coming back to later. She didn't ask. She didn't prod. She brought out 2 cups of coffee and set one beside him and sat down and pulled her coat closer and looked at the same darkness he was looking at. After a long while, he said, "I tried to make a deal." She said, "I know you did." He said he had more than I knew about. Had it for years. She didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say to it. He said, "I don't know what to do next." He'd said variations of this to himself internally many times. He had never said it out loud to another person. It felt stranger than he'd expected. Not weaker exactly, but more exposed, like opening a window in winter and finding that the cold air was cleaner than the air inside. She said, "Then let's just sit here a little while longer." So they sat. The night moved around them the way nights in that country moved slowly with enormous space in it. A coyote called once from somewhere east and wasn't answered. The horses shifted in the paddock. The coffee cooled in the cups. He didn't feel better. But he felt for the first time in what might have been years that sitting with what he didn't know was different from being defeated by it. Those were two different things. He'd spent a long time treating them as the same. After a while, she said, "My father used to say that the numbers never lied. People lie. The numbers just show you what the people did." He said, "What did the numbers in Fitch's ledger show you?" She said two things. One I expected, one I didn't. She got up and went inside. She came back with the pages she'd reconstructed from memory, her handwriting covering them in the neat columns of someone who'd grown up watching the craft and had absorbed it without realizing she had. She set them down between the cups. He looked at them in the thin light from the doorway. He said, "What's the one you didn't expect?" She pointed to a column near the right margin. A series of entries that didn't fit the pattern of the others, not land, not freight, not the ordinary commerce of a man who owned too much. These were smaller amounts, regular intervals, and next to each one a notation, a set of initials and a date. She said, "Those aren't payment records. They're expenses, recurring. Something he's paying to maintain." He looked at the dates. He said, "These go back 8 months." She said, "Yes." He said slowly, roughly, "When your father stopped writing." She said, "Yes." They looked at each other across the papers in the cold dark. He said, "Do you know what he's maintaining?" She said, "I know what I think. I don't know what I can prove." Russ Odell found them the next morning, not at the farm at the edge of the road south of town, where Cal had gone at first light to look at a stretch of fence that bordered the land Fitch's operation used for grazing. Wren was with him because he'd told her the night before that they weren't doing this separately anymore, and she'd agreed without debate. Odell came from the direction of town on a horse that moved the way its rider moved, without urgency, without the appearance of purpose. But he'd positioned himself at a point on the road where they'd have to pass him, which meant the aimlessness was performed. He was in his late 40s, deputy's badge on his coat, a face that had been pleasant once and had been through something since that had changed the character of it without destroying the basic architecture. He had the particular look of a man who had made a bad bargain some time ago and had been paying on it ever since. He said good morning to both of them. He sat on his horse and looked at Cal with something that wasn't quite directness and wasn't quite evasion. Something in between, like a man looking at a thing from the side, because he couldn't make himself look at it straight. "Cal said something on your mind, Russ." Odell said, "Maybe." He reached into his coat and brought out an envelope, and he held it, and he looked at it, and then he handed it to Cal. Inside was a letter, not official, handwritten on plain paper, the kind of letter a man writes to himself and then decides to send. It was addressed to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. It described in careful and specific language a pattern of land acquisition in Laramie County dating back to 1883. It named specific properties, specific transactions, specific discrepancies between recorded deeds and actual conditions on the ground. It was signed by Russ Odell, Deputy Sheriff, Keswick Flats. Cal looked up from the letter. "Odell said I sent that 2 days ago, a copy of it, before I decided whether to tell anyone I'd sent it. Cal said, Why are you telling me now?" Odell said nothing for a moment. He looked at the range to the west, at the dry grass and the gray sky beginning to come in from the northwest with weather in it. He said, "Because Fitch has something on me that makes me not useful to you unless you know what it is." He said it without self-pity, which was the only way a man could say it, and have it land right. He laid out the shape of it. A set of papers Fitch had constructed over the years, documents that described something Odell hadn't done, hadn't been anywhere near, but which existed now as an official-looking record of something that could destroy him if it went to the right people. He didn't say what the papers claimed. He didn't need to. The mechanism was the point. Wren said how long. Odell said 7 years. She said, and he never used them. He said he didn't need to. He just needed me to know they existed. Cal folded the letter and put it back in the envelope and held it out for Odell to take back. Odell didn't take it. He said, "Keep it. It's a copy. Cal said you said Fitch has something on you. What happens when he finds out you sent that letter?" Odell looked at him steadily. He said, "I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 7 years." He said it so quietly, so without dramatization, that it took a moment to understand what he was saying. Not a statement about insomnia. A statement about what 7 years of that kind of carrying had cost him, and what it meant that he'd decided to put it down. They sat in silence for a moment, the three of them in the cold morning with the weather coming. Then Cal said, "There's a storage building, east of the old church foundation. Bess mentioned it to me once years ago, said it used to be where the county kept tax records, before they moved the office to Laramie. Odell said, I know it. Cal said, is that where he keeps the things that don't go in the regular books? Odell said, I've never been inside it. He paused. He said, but I can tell you who goes in and out of it, and what nights, and how many of them there usually are. Siobhan Fitch was not a woman anyone talked about. That was the thing Wren had noticed from the first week, in the way you notice in absence a shape that should be filled and isn't. In a town this size, the wife of the most powerful man in the county would ordinarily be a presence. She would be at church, at the women's society meetings, at the teas and the suppers and the small public events that constituted the social life of a place like Keswick Flats. She would be visible at minimum because her husband's position required a certain display. Siobhan Fitch was not visible. She existed in the conversation of the town, the way a word exists in a sentence when it's been crossed out. You could still see the shape of it, feel where it had been, but no one was reading it anymore. Wren found her at the church on a Wednesday morning, which was the time Bess had suggested, in a sentence so oblique that Wren had spent 20 minutes afterward being sure she'd understood it correctly. The church was empty except for Siobhan, who was sitting in the last pew with her hands in her lap and her coat on, as though she'd come in from somewhere cold and hadn't decided whether she was staying. She was perhaps 50 years old. It was hard to be certain because her face had the quality of having aged on the inside, faster than the outside, which sometimes made people look younger than they were, and sometimes made them look ageless in a way that had nothing to do with health. She didn't look up when Wren came in. She said to the empty church in front of her, I didn't come here to help you. Wren sat down in the pew across the aisle. She said then, why did you come? Siobhan said, to decide whether I'm going to. They sat in the quiet of the church, which was the particular quiet of a building built for silence, Not empty silence, but held silence. The kind that accumulates over years of people bringing things into it that they couldn't say anywhere else. Siobhan said, "Do you know what keeps a woman in a place she shouldn't be?" Wren said, "Fear." Siobhan looked at her then. It was the first time she'd looked directly at her, and the look had something in it that was harder to name than simple recognition, more like the expression of a person who has been speaking into a room they thought was empty and has just discovered someone was listening. She said, "Yes." And the particular quality of fear that comes from knowing specifically what will happen if you stop being afraid. Not imagining it. Knowing. Because he's made sure you know. Wren said nothing. Siobhan looked back at the front of the church. She said, "There's a second building. Not the one on the east side, that one he lets people find occasionally. The one that matters is behind the old Lambert property a half-mile north of the main road. He uses it for the things that can't be in any building people know about." Wren said, "How do you know this?" Siobhan said, "Because I'm a woman who has spent 22 years being invisible in my own house. Invisible people see things." She opened the small bag she'd brought with her and took out a folded cloth. And inside the cloth was a key. Small brass. The kind that opened a padlock rather than a door lock. She held it out. Wren looked at it. She said, "Where did you get this?" Siobhan said he keeps 2 copies of every key he owns. One on his person, one in a box in his study. He has never once considered that I might know where the box is. Wren took the key. Siobhan folded the cloth back and put it in her bag and stood up. She said, still not looking at Wren, "I've kept records of my own. For 12 years. Everything I could copy. Everything I could document. I have them in a place he doesn't know about. I'm not giving them to you tonight. I'm telling you they exist." She said, "I want to see what you do with what I've given you. Then I'll decide the rest." She walked out of the church. The door swung shut behind her with the soft, conclusive sound of a well-hung door. Wren sat in the empty pew and held the key in her palm and looked at it. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it in the eaves of the building. Not violent, just persistent. The way wind in that country was persistent, wearing at things over time, until it had changed them so gradually, you couldn't say when the change had happened. He didn't like the plan, which was not the same as having a better one. There were 2 guards on most nights, according to Odell. Sometimes 1. The key Siobhan had provided would get them through the padlock on the east door. After that, it was a matter of finding what was there before anyone who shouldn't know they were there found out they were. Cal said, "What are we looking for specifically?" Wren said the ledger pages that match what I saw in his office, and anything about recurring expenses, and anything with my father's name. He said, "And if we find your father's name on something that tells us where he is." She said, "Then we know where to go next." He said, "And if Fitch finds out we were there." She said, "We have to be faster than Fitch." He looked at her. She said, "I know that's not a plan, but it's the condition we're in." He thought about this. He thought about the document in Fitch's desk with his name on it, and the age written next to his name, 40, and the thing he'd done at 40 that he'd spent 13 years trying not to think about. He thought about going in through the east door of a building he wasn't supposed to know about, with a key given to him by the wife of the man who owned it, to find evidence of something that he already knew enough about, to make him complicit in knowing. He thought about Emmett. He said, "We go tonight." The building was set back from the road by enough distance that it didn't read as a building at all in the dark. Just a dense absence where the sky didn't reach. No light inside. No horses tied nearby that he could see. They left their own horses a quarter-mile back and came in on foot, which took longer than it would have in daylight and required a quality of attention that was tiring in a useful way. It kept the mind from going ahead of itself. The padlock opened on the first try. That always surprised him, how smoothly a key turned in a lock that was meant to keep people out. There was something almost courteous about it. Inside was the smell of paper and cold air, and the metallic edge of something ink or lamp oil or both. He waited for his eyes to settle and then moved toward the back wall where a workbench held several stacked boxes. The kind of shallow wooden crates used for storing documents flat. He took the top box down. Wren was beside him in the dark, close enough that he could hear her breathing controlled slower than it should have been for a woman who'd just crossed a dark field in the dead of night. She was managing it deliberately. He found a small candle in his coat pocket which he'd prepared for this and a match. He shielded the light with his body and let it illuminate the papers in the crate. Numbers, names. He recognized the format. It matched what Wren had described from Fitch's office, the legitimate face of things. He set that box aside. The second box had different paper. Heavier stock, the kind used for documents meant to last. He went through it carefully, page by page, holding each sheet briefly in the candle's reach. He found the ledger section that matched what Wren had memorized. And he found the notation column she'd flagged, the recurring expenses, the initials, the dates. He found Fletcher Calloway's name, and beside it not an initial but a word held, and beside that word, a location described in 4 words that Cal recognized. Because he knew that place, had ridden past it a dozen times, had noted without much interest that it was abandoned. He held the candle close to be sure he'd read it right. He had. He looked at Wren. She was reading over his shoulder, and he knew from the quality of her stillness that she'd seen the same thing. He looked back at the page. There were other names on it, 6 of them, each with the same word beside it, held, and one of the other names, third from the top, written in the same unhurried hand as all the others, was Emmett Driscoll. Cal looked at that name for a long time. The candle burned. The cold air moved through the building from some gap in the boards he hadn't located. Outside, something, an animal, or the wind in the grass, or nothing, made a sound, and then didn't make it again. Wren put her hand on his arm, just briefly, just the weight of it, and then she took it away. He folded the page and put it inside his coat. He blew out the candle. He said in the dark, quietly, "I know where that location is." She said, "So, do we go tonight?" He thought about what was in his coat. He thought about the name he'd just read, and all the years that name had been sitting in a drawer with a letter he hadn't opened. He thought about the word beside it, and what it meant that his brother's name was on a list that included a living man. He said, "We go tonight." They went back out through the east door. He locked the padlock behind them. The sky had cleared while they were inside. and the stars were back enormous and indifferent the way they always were in that country. They walked back through the dark grass toward the horses, and the only sound was the ground under their feet and the wind moving over the plain. He thought Emmett's name on that list didn't mean what he needed it to mean. The dates didn't line up. He knew that if he worked through the arithmetic, he would arrive at the same answer he'd been avoiding for 13 years, which was that his brother had not been held. His brother had been gone in a different way, a permanent way, and the list was something else, an older record that had never been cleaned up or was being used for something he didn't fully understand yet. He thought all of this working through it in the cold dark, and he came out the other side of it at the same place he always came out, which was that he had failed his brother once by staying quiet, and he was not going to do it again by staying home. Whatever the list meant, whatever the truth of it was, he was going to find Fletcher Calloway, and he was going to find what was in that location. And then he was going to know what he knew, instead of carrying what he didn't. The horses were where they'd left them. He untied his and stood for a moment with his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of it in the cold night. He said to Wren, who was already mounted and waiting without impatience, "Whatever we find out there, you need to be ready for it to be different than what you're expecting." She said, "I've been ready for that since the day I got on the train." He mounted and they rode northwest into the dark, toward a place he'd ridden past a dozen times, and always found reason enough to keep moving. He didn't keep moving now. The building was dark when they reached it, not the comfortable dark of a place that had simply been closed up for the night. Something older than that. The dark of a structure that had been forgotten on purpose, that people had learned not to look at directly. The way you learn not to look at certain things in a town where looking costs too much. It had been a working cattle operation once. Cal knew that from the shape of the pens still visible in the moonlight, as collapsed geometry posts leaning at angles that told you the direction the weather came from. Whatever had made it a working place had been methodically removed. What remained was the frame of it, the suggestion. They came in from the north on foot horses left behind a low rise that broke the skyline. The ground was hard under the frost, and their steps made less sound than he'd expected, which was useful, and also strange, like the land was holding its breath. He stopped 30 yards out and looked at the building for a long time. No light. No horses. No sound from inside that reached him over the wind. He said quietly, "Stay close." She said nothing, which meant yes. The main door had a chain on it, but the chain was looped rather than locked. The kind of security that discourages casual entry and stops no one who means it. He lifted the chain and set it aside. The door moved inward on hinges that were better maintained than anything else about the building, which told him something about how the building was actually used. Inside, the smell hit him first the way it always did in closed spaces. Stale air, old wood, and under that, something human, the particular residue of a confined life. His eyes found the shapes in the darkness slowly. Stalls along the right wall. A loft above partially collapsed. A rusted stove in the far corner with a length of pipe that disappeared into the ceiling. He heard the breathing before he saw the man. It was coming from the far end of the left wall behind what had been a grain partition. He moved toward. It ran close behind him and found the partition hinged to swing outward. and behind it, on a bedroll on the ground, a man, old enough to have gray at his temples, thin in the way of someone who has been given enough to survive and not enough to be comfortable. His wrists had old marks on them from rope long since healed, but visible even in the dark because of the particular texture scar tissue leaves on skin. He was breathing with the shallow regularity of someone who has learned to sleep light because light sleeping is safer. Cal crouched down. He said, "Fletcher." The man came awake in the specific way of someone whose sleep had never been deep enough. Not startled, just immediately present, immediately reading the room. His eyes found Cal first, and then moved to Wren. And what happened in his face when he saw her was not the melodrama of a reunion so much as the involuntary collapse of a thing he'd been holding rigid for a very long time. He said her name. She said, "I'm here." She crouched beside him and he reached out, and she took his hand. And that was all. No tears, no speeches. Just the physical fact of finding the person you'd crossed half a continent to find. Cal stood up and gave them a moment, turning back toward the door and listening to the night outside. Wind in the grass. Nothing else. Then he heard the horses. They came from the south, which was the direction of town, which meant someone had known, or guessed, or been told. 3 riders, maybe 4. He couldn't be precise from the sound, but he could hear that they were moving with purpose and not trying to be quiet about it, which meant they didn't think they needed to be. He moved back to Wren. He said, "We have company. Help him up." Fletcher was weak but functional, a man who had kept himself mobile in a small space because some part of him had insisted on staying ready for the moment readiness would matter. He got to his feet with Wren's help and stood slightly unsteady and looked at Cal with the clear eyes of someone whose mind was still sound, even if the rest of him had been through a long time of difficulty. Fletcher said, "How many?" Cal said, "Enough." Fletcher said, "There's a back wall. Boards on the northeast corner have been worked loose from the inside. I've been working on them for 2 months." Cal looked at him. Fletcher said with the particular dryness of a man who has had a lot of time to think, "I am a bookkeeper. I plan things. It's what I do." Cal said, "Get him out through there. Head north away from the road." "I'll follow," Wren said. "And if you don't?" He looked at her in the dark. He said, "I'll follow." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she put her arm around her father's waist, and they moved toward the northeast corner. Cal turned toward the front of the building. He heard the horses pull up outside. Heard voices low, not urgent. The voices of men who believe the situation is managed. He heard Fitch's voice among them, and felt with a clarity that had nothing to do with surprise that he had known this moment was coming since the morning 11 days ago when a stranger had stood at his fence line and delivered a message that wasn't really a question. He moved to the side of the door out of the direct line of it and waited. Fitch came in first, not because he was brave, because he'd never had reason to develop the habit of letting other men go first into uncertain situations. He'd always been the man who set the terms of uncertain situations rather than walking into them. It was, Cal thought, going to be an educational moment for him. He had 2 men with him inside and 2 more stayed with the horses. The 2 inside had lanterns which they raised, and the light swung across the empty space and found the empty bedroll and the open partition. and Fitch's face did something that Cal had not seen it do before in any of their previous interactions. It went genuinely still, the stillness of a man absorbing real information rather than performing the reception of information he already had. Then one of the men with lanterns moved his light to the left and found Cal standing against the wall. Fitch looked at him. He said, after a moment, "You never struck me as a man who'd break into a building." Cal said, "You never struck me as a man who'd keep people in one." Fitch moved into the room. His two men spread slightly to either side, not dramatically, just enough to widen the angle of the conversation. Fitch said, "The girl and her father are gone." Cal said, "Seems that way." Fitch said, "That's gonna make things complicated for everyone, including you." Cal said, "I've been complicated for a while now." Fitch looked at him with something that was not quite patience and not quite calculation. A kind of professional assessment, the look of a man deciding what category a problem falls into before deciding how to address it. He said, "Cal, you know what I have on you. You've known it for 13 years. And you've been, I want to say this clearly, a model of good sense in all that time. This thing tonight doesn't have to change that." Cal said, "I know what you have on me." Fitch said, "Then you understand that walking out of here tonight doesn't actually help you. Whatever you think you found, whatever the girl's father told her, you can't bring any of it to anyone without bringing yourself to them at the same time." Cal said, "That's probably true." Fitch said, "So what is it you think you're doing?" The question was genuine. Not mocking, genuinely curious, the way a man is curious about a problem that doesn't fit any category he recognizes. Cal thought about the document in Fitch's desk drawer with his name on it and his age at the time. He thought about the list in the building east of the church with Emmett's name on it, and the arithmetic he'd worked through on the ride out here, and the answer the arithmetic came to. He thought about the envelope in the dry sink drawer, 13 years unread. He thought about a 24-year-old woman who had crossed half the country on a thin plan because she'd made a promise to herself about her father and had executed it without flinching, and had made mistakes and owned them and kept going. He thought about the moment at Fitch's desk when he'd tried to trade his silence for a result and had discovered that his silence was already owned, had been owned for years. And he thought about what it meant that he'd spent 13 years protecting something that turned out not to be in his possession. He said, "I'm doing the thing I should have done in 1876. Fitch went still again. Cal said, "It won't fix what happened then. I know that. Emmett is gone and he's been gone, and nothing I do now changes that. But you've been using what happened then for 13 years as a way to keep me standing still. And I've been letting you because I thought the thing you were using was something I was carrying and needed to protect." He said, "I wasn't carrying it. You were. You've been carrying it this whole time because that's the only way it works. Someone has to hold the threat for it to be a threat. And I'm telling you now that I don't care anymore what you do with it." He said, "I'm not afraid of a document that says true things about me. I'm more afraid of spending the rest of my life being a man who lets the true things about him be used to prevent him from doing anything worth doing." The room was quiet. One of the men with a lantern shifted his weight. The other looked at Fitch. Fitch said carefully, "That's a brave speech." Cal said, "It's not a speech. It's just what's true." He took a step toward the door. One of Fitch's men moved to block him, and that was when everything happened at once. It went the way these things go, not cleanly, not with any of the clarity that comes afterward when you describe them. It went in pieces, each one following from the last, with the internal logic of a situation that has been waiting for a trigger and has finally found one. Cal was 53 years old with a bad left knee and the accumulated weight of a life that had not been gentle. And he was also a man who had spent decades doing physical work and who had in an earlier part of his life learned from harder teachers than Fitch's hired men how to operate in a space that had turned violent. He took the first man down before the man had finished committing to the movement. Not elegantly, there was nothing elegant about it, just the application of leverage and timing in a way that ended the man's involvement in the evening quickly and without discussion. The lantern went with him and shattered, and the room dropped to one light source. The second man was more careful, which gave Fitch time to move, and for a moment the geometry of it was bad. 2 points of pressure, one light and a bad knee that was informing him loudly of its opinion of the proceedings. Then the door opened. Russ Odell came through it with his lantern and his badge and his revolver, and he came through it in the way of a man who has made a decision. He's been postponing for 7 years and is now executing it with the thoroughness of someone who wants to be sure it counts. He said, "Nobody move." Fitch's second man looked at the badge and made the calculation that men in that situation make, whether the badge was real, whether the man behind it was committed, whether the arithmetic favored movement. He made the right calculation. He didn't move. Fitch looked at Odell. He said, "Russ." Odell said, "I know what you're going to say." Fitch said, "Do you understand what I'm going to do?" Odell said, "Yes. And I've sent a copy of everything to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne. If something happens to me, they already have it." Fitch said, "That's not." Odell said, "I know it's not sufficient on its own. I know it doesn't cover everything. But it's out of your hands now, Harlan. That's the part that matters to me." He said it with the flatness of a man saying something he's known for a long time was the only available ending. Fitch stood in the one remaining lantern's light in the middle of an empty building that had been built for something legitimate and been used for something else. And he looked at the two men who were not going to let this go the way it had always gone, and something shifted in his face. Not contrition, not fear. Something more fundamental than either the expression of a man who has built a very large and specific architecture and is watching it develop a crack in the foundation. He said to Cal, "You understand this doesn't end well for you." Cal said, "I know." Fitch said the document. Cal said, "I know." I said, "I know." He said it without heat, without triumph, just clearly. He said, "Do what you have to do with it. I'll do what I have to do." They brought Fitch and his men into Keswick Flats before dawn. Not in chains. Odell didn't have chains, and the practical architecture of the situation didn't require them. What it required was the specific authority of a man with a badge who had decided after 7 years of not using it to use it. That turned out to be sufficient. Fitch walked. His men walked. They walked because the alternative was to run into a territory at night from a situation that was already moving against them. And men like that don't run when there's still a version of events in which they might recover. Cal rode beside Odell and didn't say much. Odell said at one point, "The Cheyenne letter is real." Cal said, I know. Odell said I sent it 3 days ago. Before any of this, Cal said I figured. They rode in silence for a while. The sky was beginning to change in the east. Not light yet, just the first suggestion that darkness was considering its options. Odell said, what happens to you with the 1876 thing? Cal said, I don't know. He said, I expect I'll find out. Odell said nothing more about it. Wren and Fletcher were at Bess Morrow's house when Cal arrived. Bess had a back room she kept for people who needed somewhere to be that wasn't anywhere official, which was not a common need in Keswick Flats, but also not unheard of. And she had exercised the judgment she'd been exercising for 18 years without asking anyone's permission, by putting them in it and making coffee and providing a blanket and then leaving them alone. This was, Cal thought, exactly what Bess would do. He sat in Bess's kitchen and drank the coffee she set in front of him without being asked. And they didn't talk much. Outside the window, the sky was fully changing now, gray giving way to the particular pale color of Wyoming mornings, which wasn't quite gold and wasn't quite silver, and didn't really have a name. After a while, Bess said, How's the knee? He said it's had better nights. She said you should probably let someone look at it. He said probably. She said you're not going to. He said not tonight. She refilled his cup. After another while, she said, not looking at him, What Siobhan did took something. He said, I know it did. Bess said she left before first light. Took a bag she'd had packed, I think, for a while. He said, Do you know where she went? Bess said no. She didn't say, and I didn't ask. Sometimes that's the right arrangement. He thought about a woman who had spent 22 years being invisible in her own house, keeping records in secret, waiting for something she wasn't sure would ever come. He thought about the key she'd pressed into Wren's hand and the words she'd said before she'd left. I want to see what you do with what I've given you. He thought about the fact that she'd seen enough to make her decision, and had made it, and had been gone before the sun was up. He thought that was courage of a specific kind, the kind that doesn't look like courage, because it doesn't announce itself, the kind that operates in the dark, and in silence, and over years, which is harder than any single night of it. He said, I hope she lands somewhere decent. Bess said I expect she will. She was always more capable than anyone around her knew. The back room had a window that faced east, and the morning light was coming through it when Cal knocked and went in. Fletcher was sitting up on the cot with a cup of coffee that Bess had brought him, color returning to his face in gradual increments the way color returns to a fire that's been banked low and is being asked to come back up. Wren sat in the chair beside him with her coat still on. She looked at Cal when he came in. He said it's done for tonight. Fletcher said Fitch. Cal said Odell has him. There are federal people coming from Cheyenne. It won't be fast and it won't be clean, but it's started. Fletcher said the books. Cal said we have what we found in the building. Wren has what she memorized from the office, and Siobhan Fitch has apparently been keeping her own records for 12 years. Fletcher sat with this for a moment. He said, Siobhan. Good Lord. He said it in the voice of a man revising a significant portion of his understanding of a situation. Cal looked at Wren. She looked back at him. Neither of them said anything about that because there was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. Cal said he'd give them time, and he'd be outside. He went back to the kitchen and found Bess had gone into the store to start her morning, which was sensible because the store opened at 7, regardless of what had happened the night before. And the particular genius of people like Bess was that they understood that the ordinary operation of the world was not a betrayal of the extraordinary, but a necessary part of its continuation. He sat alone in her kitchen. He thought about what Fitch would do with the 1876 document. He thought about what Fitch would say to the federal men from Cheyenne, which would certainly involve raising every question he could raise about the people who'd brought evidence against him, which was how men like Fitch operated, not by disputing the evidence, but by attacking the credibility of the people carrying it. His credibility specifically. He thought about that for a while without finding a comfortable place to put it. He was still sitting there when the light had fully come up and the town had started its day around him. And he heard the back door, and Wren came in and poured herself coffee and sat across from him. He told her about the document. He told her all of it, 1876, what had happened, what he'd done and what he hadn't done, and what the result of it had been. He said it plainly in the same way he'd said it to Fitch, because it was the same thing in daylight as it was in a dark building, and he wasn't going to manage it differently depending on the audience. She listened without changing her expression. When he was done, she said, "You were a deputy." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you knew something was going to happen." He said, "I knew Emmett had information that made him a target. I knew who the target was. I had enough to act on, and I didn't act on it because I was trying to protect myself from the consequences of what acting would have meant." She said, "And Emmett died?" He said, "Yes." Silence. She said, "And you've been here ever since?" He said, "I moved a few times. Ended up here." She said, "In the same county?" He said, "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "That doesn't sound like someone who was running away from it." He said, "I don't know what it sounds like." She said, "It sounds like someone who couldn't leave it entirely. Someone who stayed near it because leaving would have been one more thing of the same kind." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not forgiving you. It's not mine to forgive." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm telling you what I see when I look at it. Because you've been carrying it like it's one thing, and I think it might be two things, what you did, and what you did with what you did after." He thought about that for a moment. He said, "That's a generous reading." She said, "It's an accurate reading. Whether it's generous is a different question." Outside, they could hear the town going about its morning, a wagon on the street. Voices somewhere down the block. The sound of the smithy starting its fire. The world persisting in the particular way it persisted, indifferent to the weight of any individual night. He said, "I have to tell you something about the list in that building." He told her about Emmett's name on it. He told her about the dates and the arithmetic and what the arithmetic meant. He told her in the same plain voice he'd used for everything else. She listened. When he was done, she said, "I'm sorry." He said he was a long time gone. She said, "That doesn't change what it is." He said, "No, it doesn't." They sat in Bess's kitchen with the morning light coming through the window and the ordinary sounds of the town coming through the walls. and he felt something that he didn't have a precise word for. Not resolution, because resolution implied a cleanness he didn't think he'd earned. More like the particular quality of a weight that has been set down. Not gone. Just not carried anymore. Fletcher came out an hour later, walking slowly but walking. He sat at the table and Bess produced food for all of them, without being asked the kind of breakfast that required effort, and was provided without comment, which was its own form of statement. Fletcher was a methodical man, and a careful one, and over breakfast he laid out what he'd found before he'd been taken in the organized, precise language of a man who'd had 8 months to put his information in order in his head, since he hadn't had paper to put it on. He described the 2 sets of books, the specific properties affected the structure of the fraudulent provisions in the contracts. He described what he'd been doing and when and who he'd spoken to. He said, "I knew it was dangerous before I got to the end of it. I thought I'd have more time to move what I'd found somewhere safe before he realized I'd realized." He said I was wrong about how fast he moved. Cal said you weren't wrong. He just moved faster. Fletcher looked at him across the table. He said, "I want to know what you are to my daughter." Cal said at the moment her husband. Fletcher looked at Wren. She said, "We had reasons that made sense." Fletcher said, "Do they still make sense?" She said, "Some of them. Others I'm less sure about." She said it honestly, not deflecting. Cal heard it and said nothing. Fletcher looked between them for a moment. The particular look of a father who has been away for a long time and is recalibrating the distance between where he left things and where they are now. He said, "I see." Then he went back to his coffee, which was, Cal thought, exactly the right response. That afternoon, Cal fixed the fence post he'd left unfinished the morning after Wren arrived. He'd been meaning to get back to it. It was a simple job, the kind of job that existed in approximately 100 variations on any working spread. The steady, modest labor of maintaining something against the entropy of weather and time. He'd missed it, actually, in the way you miss simple things when simple things become unavailable. Wren came out. He said, "You don't have to." She said, "I know. I'm going to anyway." She picked up the mallet he'd set aside and looked at it with the frank appraisal of someone who has no illusions about their competence at an unfamiliar task. She said, "What do I do?" He said, "Hold the post straight while I tamp the base." She held it. He tamped. The post went in solid. He took the mallet from her and drove the top twice to seat it, and then he stepped back and looked at it. He said that one will hold. She looked at it too. She said, "My father wants to stay." He said, "I figured." She said, "Not here. Not in this town. But in this territory." He says there's enough work for a careful bookkeeper in a county that's been run by a dishonest one. And he's probably not wrong. He said he's not wrong. She said so we'd be nearby. He said, "Would you want to be nearby?" She looked out at the range, the same range she'd looked at on the first morning from the wagon when she'd been recalibrating her expectations of a place she'd never been. Her expression was different now. Not because the land was different, because she had a different kind of claim on it than she'd had then. She bled for it more or less, and you see a landscape differently when that's true. She said, "I came here for one reason. I found it. Now I have to figure out if there are other reasons." He said that seems like a reasonable thing to figure out. She said, "Yes, it does." She took the mallet from him and handed him the next post and held it straight while he drove it, and they worked through the remaining section of fence. In this way, him setting her holding both of them, adjusting for the places where the ground was harder and the places where it gave easily. They didn't talk much while they worked. There wasn't much that needed to be said that wasn't already said by the fact of the work itself. When they finished, she looked at the line of its solid level, ready for whatever the winter would bring. She said, "Not bad for people who don't know what they're doing." He said, "We knew what we were doing." She said, "Some of it." He said, "Enough of it." The federal men arrived from Cheyenne 8 days later. 2 of them careful and professional, with the particular kind of thoroughness that men from the federal office brought to situations where a great deal of paperwork had to be reconciled with a great deal of reality. They were there for 2 weeks. Fitch had lawyers, which meant the process was slow and layered and generated enormous quantities of additional paperwork. But Fletcher's records and the records Siobhan had maintained, and what Cal and Wren had retrieved from the storage building, and Odell's account of 7 years of complicit observation, together they made a weight that even good lawyers couldn't move entirely. Agreements were scrutinized. Provisions found unenforceable. Some land came back to the people it had been taken from. Some of it didn't because legal recovery is never complete. And the people who design these systems know that incompleteness is a feature rather than a failure. The document about 1876 came up. Cal had expected it to. He answered every question he was asked about it honestly, which was what he'd told himself he would do, and what, when the moment arrived, turned out to be easier than the 13 years of not doing it had suggested it would be. Not painless, easier. The federal men noted his account, filed it, told him there might be further questions. There weren't in the end. Whether that was because the questions answered themselves or because other matters took precedence, Cal never fully knew. He didn't press for certainty about it. He had what he had, which was the record of having told the truth about a thing he'd spent a long time not telling the truth about. And that was what he'd wanted. Whether it constituted justice in any formal sense was a question he left to people whose job was to answer it. He found the envelope in the drawer on the morning the federal men left town, not because he went looking for it. He went to the drawer for the property deed which he needed for something the federal process required. And there it was beside the deed, yellow and soft-edged patient, in the way that only inanimate objects can be patient. He took it out. He stood in the kitchen with it in his hands for a moment, the same way he'd stood with it 100 times before. The same weight, the same familiar shape. Wren was outside with her father, the 2 of them walking the property line which Fletcher had asked to see as a practical matter of understanding the place his daughter was living in. Cal had watched them go from the window, a woman and her father moving through the dry grass in the October morning. Their voices inaudible, their manner easy in the specific way of 2 people who have been apart and are relearning the grammar of being together. He opened the envelope. The paper inside was 1 sheet folded once. The writing was Emmett's. He would have known it anywhere, the slight leftward lean of it, the particular way his brother had formed his capital letters, formal and a little careful, as if Emmett had always been writing for an audience he wasn't sure would be sympathetic. He read it. 1 paragraph, short, written from the date at the top, 6 days before Emmett died. It said, "Cal, I know you know, and I know you didn't say anything. I'm not writing this to tell you that I understand because I'm not sure I do. But I'm writing it because I don't want the last thing between us to be something unspoken. Whatever happens next, I want you to know that I loved you. And I believed you were a good man even when you weren't acting like one. Maybe especially then. I hope you get to be what I believed you were. Emmett. He read it twice. Then he stood in the kitchen for a while with the letter in his hands, and the morning light coming through the window at the angle it came through at this time of year, and the sounds of the property coming in from outside. Wren's voice somewhere a horse shifting in the paddock. A bird in the cottonwood by the creek that ran a quarter-mile west. He folded the letter, not back into the envelope. He folded it smaller and put it in the pocket of his shirt against his chest, which was where he'd carry it from now on. He put the empty envelope back in the drawer. He went outside. Wren and Fletcher were at the far end of the property by the time he crossed the yard, and he didn't call out to them, just walked in the same direction. Not hurrying the way you walk when the destination isn't going anywhere. The morning was cold and clear and very large. The sky over Wyoming in October is the kind of sky that reminds you that weather is not something that happens around human life, but something human life happens inside of, and that the proportion of those two things is one that the land out here never lets you forget. He thought about Emmett writing that letter 6 days before he died, knowing something was wrong, not knowing the shape of it, taking the time to write a paragraph to his younger brother. Not because it would change anything, but because he didn't want something unspoken to be the last thing between them. He thought about what it meant that Emmett had believed him to be a good man, even when he wasn't acting like one. He thought about whether that belief had been warranted. He thought probably not then, possibly somewhat now. Maybe if he kept doing the work eventually. That was as much certainty as he thought he was entitled to. And he found walking across his own land in the October morning with the letter in his pocket, and the sound of his wife's voice drifting toward him on the cold air, that it was enough. It wasn't a comfortable enough. It wasn't an ending that tied itself up and removed the difficulty. It was a working enough, the kind you carry forward and add to. Over time, the kind that requires you to keep showing up rather than arriving somewhere and being finished. He'd spent 13 years standing still. He could live with a working enough. Wren saw him coming and said something to her father, and Fletcher raised a hand in the simple acknowledgement of a man who doesn't waste gesture, and then turned to look at something on the fence line while his daughter walked back to meet Cal. They stood facing each other in the grass with the whole of the property behind them, and the high country visible on the horizon white at the peaks, now winter making its case from the top down. She said, "My father thinks the fence line on the south edge needs attention. He said he's not wrong. She said he also thinks you know what you're doing. He said with fences. She said among other things." He looked at her. She said, "I've been thinking about what I told my father, about whether there are other reasons to stay." He said, "Have you reached a conclusion?" She said, "I've reached the beginning of one," which I think is different from not having reached anything. He said, "It is different." She said, "I want to be somewhere that needs what I can do, not because of gratitude or because things worked out, because there are people in this county who sign papers they didn't understand, and some of them are going to need someone to explain to them what the papers actually say and what can still be done about it. She said, I know that. I can do that. And I want to. She said the rest of things I'm less certain about. But I thought you should know the part I am certain about. He said I appreciate that. She said, I know you do. They stood in the grass for a moment, the wind moving between them. He said, I opened the letter. She looked at him. She knew which letter. He said it was what I needed it to be, not what I wanted it to be, what I needed. She said, is there a difference? He said, yes. The thing you want lets you off. The thing you need gives you somewhere to go. She was quiet for a moment. She said, and now you have somewhere to go. He said, I think so. I'm going to find out. She nodded once, not as an ending to the conversation, as an acknowledgement of something she'd seen and was choosing to recognize. She turned and walked back toward her father, who was still studying the fence line, with the conscientious attention of a man who has spent a long time not being able to do anything and is now compensating. Cal stood where he was for a moment. Then he turned toward the south fence line. He walked out to where Fletcher was standing, and the older man moved over slightly to make room, and the two of them stood looking at the fence in the practical way of men who have agreed without saying so that there is work to be done, and they are the ones who are going to do it. Cal said, you're right about the south edge. Fletcher said, I thought so. He said tomorrow, Cal said tomorrow. Al. Above them, the sky was the enormous blue of high country October, and the fence line ran west toward the ridge until it disappeared in the brightness. And somewhere behind them, Wren was walking back toward the house, with her coat pulled close, and her face turned into the wind going toward something rather than away from something, which was, he thought, the only direction worth traveling in the time a person had. He looked at the fence line. He thought about what needed doing. He thought all right. Then he started doing it.